Okay, we're going to talk about ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is sometimes described as the energy currency of a cell. Okay, so you may have like money in the bank, that's like glucose, but you can't really get hold of that. So you use cash, and ATP is, that's the analogy. The glucose is the money in the bank, ATP is like the cash. Anyway, we'll see what that means in practical terms in a minute. But let's look at the structure of ATP. You probably recognize some of this. This is adenine over here. Adenine. Now you don't call it adenine triphosphate because it's also got this bit here, which is actually ribose. It looks like deoxyribose, but it's ribose because you can tell it's ribose because it's got an OH there. DNA, it's got deoxyribose and OH on that carbon. And then instead of having just one phosphate, and that attached to the next ribose along, this has got 3 phosphates on the end. And this is quite interesting because the cell, living things, they're using similar molecules for completely different reasons. So we've got nucleotides, and if you just cover up that bit, you basically got a nucleotide, which is a building block of DNA. That's an information containing molecule. Whereas this one, ATP, nothing to do with information, it's used to do with energy, but they're using the same, very similar building blocks to do a completely different job. And you see that quite a lot in biology. Okay, so, right, we've got 3 phosphates there. Now, very often you don't usually write it, you don't have to remember that structure. Very often it will be written like this. It's written adenine, ribose, and then your 3 phosphates. Now, very often you will see written in books is when you get, this is ATP here, okay, and when ATP loses this N-phosphate group there, it will become ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and you'll get, sometimes that's written as PI, which stands for inorganic phosphate, and that is, you get energy released. Now, that is a little bit confusing because, to say that, is because we are breaking a bond there and we're getting energy release. This is exothermic. And we know from GCSE chemistry that when you break a bond, you need to give energy in. That's endothermic. So this is just cause a little bit of confusion. So this isn't quite true to write this like that. What's really happening is ATP is reacting with water, and it's been hydrolyzed. And there's this diagram down the left I'll show you. So really what's happening, ATP is reacting with H2O to form adenosine diphosphate and inorganic phosphate, and that is exothermic. So this really, although you see this written quite a lot and people just forget about the water, you shouldn't really do that because it is confusing. So now, in a lot of old textbooks, you will see, right, so what have we got here? We've got ATP on the left, at the top, and we've got turning into ADP here. In some old textbooks, not so much in new ones because people have wised up a bit, they used to say, right, this phosphate gets broken off the end there. And so they say this bond is a high energy bond, that one you're breaking. And that is not true. It's actually a low energy bond. We'll see why, but don't worry too much about it. But right, we've got ATP, sorry, ATP, and it's reacting with water. It's hydrolyzed. So let's have a look at the bonds that are broken. So I'll do broken bonds in green. Okay. So now to broken bonds, to break bonds, that requires energy. That's endothermic. Which bonds are we breaking? Well, we've got to break that bond between the hydrogen and the oxygen there. That's a pretty strong bond. And we've also got to break this one here, and that's like quite a weak bond. So you don't actually need that much energy to break that bond between the phosphorus and the oxygen. What new bonds have we formed? So this is made. Okay, so that's energy released. That's exothermic. Well, we have made A new bond there. That one is new between the oxygen and the phosphorus. Now that oxygen-phosphorus bond is a lot stronger than the one you broken. That's where all the energy comes from. And then also we've made this bond between the hydrogen and the oxygen on the phosphate there. And that's kind of an average strength. But it's because the bond that you're making is a lot stronger than the bond that you break. Hydrolyzing ATP is pretty exothermic. It is about minus 30 kilojoules per mole. Okay, the minus sign means it's exo. That's the convention. If you have a minus sign, it's in chemistry. That means it's an exothermic change. Okay, so let's see what ATP is for then. Okay, now it's important to realize here, if you think of all the chemical reactions that you know, they're nearly all exothermic. And if you try to think of an endothermic reaction, you'd be hard pushed to remember one. Okay, now this is a bit of an approximation, but endothermic reactions are impossible. Thermodynamically, they are impossible. That's not quite true. What I should say is endogonic. Now, you don't know what that word means. You can look it up. It doesn't mean exactly the same thing as exothermic, as endothermic, but it is very similar. For our reasons, you can just consider it's the same thing. So they're thermodynamically impossible, whereas reactions which are exothermic, they are possible. So in a cell, you want to turn, let's say you want to turn A into B. You want to make something, okay? Cells are always making new things. That's what metabolism is all about. And that, if that is an endothermic reaction, that is impossible. That can't happen. So you cannot make B, and you need to make B. Well, how does ATP help out here? Well, we've seen that ATP plus water goes to ADP plus inorganic phosphate, and that is exothermic. So let's say that this reaction is endothermic. That's plus 20 kilojoules per mole. The plus tells us it's endothermic. And this reaction is exothermic. Let's say this is minus 30 kilojoules per mole. Let's see what happens if you combine these two reactions together then. So if you combine these two reactions together, you get A plus ATP plus water goes to B plus ADP plus inorganic phosphate. Now, is it exothermic or endothermic? Well, all we've got to do is add these two together. So plus 20 minus 30, that gives us minus 10 kilojoules per mole. So it is exothermic, so it is possible. So we can able to make B using ATP to drive the forward reaction, to drive the reaction forward, to stop the reaction being endothermic and make it exothermic. That's what ATP is all about. It's all about making these endothermic changes, which are thermodynamically impossible, making them possible. Let's sort of think about the things the kind of chemical reactions in that are endothermic. So let's think endothermic reactions driven by ATP. I should say driven by ATP hydrolysis. And that's understood. Okay, so things like making big molecules out of small molecules. So amino acids going to proteins. That's endothermic, you need ATP for that. If you've got nucleotides and you want to turn them small molecules, you want to turn them into big ones like DNA, that's going to require, that's endothermic, you need ATP. A lot of cells pump ions against the concentration gradient. So active transport, in other words, that's endothermic. You need ATP for that. Now, the nervous system is always pumping ions, sodium and potassium ions against concentration gradients. They need that in order for the nerve impulse to be generated. And so they're pumping away all the time. The nervous system uses a lot of energy for that. And that's why your brain uses a lot of the, as a big energy intake. Okay, so that's just a few examples of changes in cells or in organisms that are endothermic and require ATP to drive them forward. Another one there would be muscle contraction, which I meant to add. Muscle contraction is a chemical reaction. And year 13, you look at the chemicals involved with that, but it's just a chemical reaction and you need ATP to drive it forward. Okay, so let's have a think about how we generate ATP. And again, we won't look at any details, but let's look at the overall changes. So we're going to get glucose. So C6H12O6, 6 oxygens. Aerobic respiration, you get 6 CO2, and you get 6 H2O. Now, if you burn glucose in oxygen, it's very exothermic, and the amount of energy you get out for that, well, the enthalpy change is the energy out, okay, is minus 2,800 kilojoules per mole of glucose. It's a lot of energy. Obviously, if you just burn glucose, that is not very useful because all the energy is just turned into heat. It's not, and we want to use it for doing things like pumping ions, building big molecules, muscle contraction. That's not useful. That's just wasted as heat. So every time, what happens in cells is when you combust 1 mole of glucose, what happens is various figures rise, but most so you get about 36 ADPs and inorganic phosphates, 36 inorganic phosphates. That will make 36 ATP molecules. And you will also get 36 molecules of water out there as well. Now, we said before, if you, that 1 ADP, well, we said the reverse of it actually, but 1 ADP plus an inorganic phosphate giving you 1 ATP and a water, that will, is endothermic because you're making ATP from ADP, so the opposite way around. So that's going to be plus 30 kilojoules per mole. Okay, so for 36, times that by 36, the amount of energy that would require would be 1,800 plus 1,800 kilojoules. Now you can see, so every time you oxidize 1 molecule of glucose, you get 36 ATP molecules. That would require that much energy. You actually get more energy out than that in glucose, so you get that much. So what happens to the rest of the energy from the glucose? Well, that is wasted as heat. So it's not that efficient really, but because heat's not useful to cells. In fact, it can be a nuisance because it makes them get too hot. And then you have to, human beings, when they exercise, have to try and cool down by sweating, for example. The aim really of this process is to try and get as much of this energy that's released, not being released as heat, but stored in the chemical energy, the ATP molecules, so that it can be used in a more useful way rather than just being wasted as heat. So that's what we mean by ATP being the chemical currency of the cell. I say every time you oxidize a glucose molecule, you make a load of ATP, which can be used for useful things, but you also get more than half of it wasted as heat. So that's why if you do exercise, you will get hot because only just under half of that is being turned into chemical energy, and a lot of it is being wasted. Okay,